It was one of my Thursday nights working at the hospital. Memory serves me right, it was around 10 or 11 o'clock when I was paged to call the nurses' station in the emergency department. When I called, they told me a patient had just coded, and there was a family member with them, and they asked me if I would come down to be with the family member. When I got to the room, I saw the staff working on the patient, and one of the folks told me that the patient's wife had gone off to the family waiting room. So I walk over to the family waiting room, and the patient's wife is making a phone call. "He just died," she told the person she was calling. When she completed the call, I introduced myself and I offered a prayer. Then she made a couple more calls and delivered the same message. So as you can imagine, I'm a bit confused. And my confusion wasn't resolved when I walked back to the room and the patient had a heartbeat. I told one of the doctors about the phone calls, and he told me it was very unlikely that they would be able to keep the patient's heart beating. So the doctor and I went back to the waiting room to talk with the patient's wife, and she authorized us to stop CPR. The doctor left to go back to the patient. After he was gone, the patient's wife looked at me, and she said, "What am I going to do?" As I sat with her, the folks she had called began to arrive in the waiting room, and as she hugged each one of them, she looked at them and said, "What am I going to do?" Eventually, one of the nurses came for us, and we went back to the room. As we stood around the bed, she offered her final goodbyes to her husband and asked the question once again, "What am I going to do?" And as we were standing there, it occurred to me, here we are standing in the emergency department of a busy hospital on the outskirts of a city. There were doctors, nurses, technicians, other patients and their families, her family and friends, and a chaplain. But at this point in time, that patient's wife was in the wilderness, and all she could think about is, what am I going to do? So last week we heard Exodus 14. The Israelites were being pursued by the Egyptians, and God parted the Red Sea so they could cross. The Egyptians decided to follow them in the sea, and God returned the sea to normal, and the Egyptian army was destroyed. Our text ended with the author telling us that the people feared the Lord and believed in the Lord and the Lord's servant, Moses. So chapter 15, we read the song of Moses and the song of Miriam. Then Moses directs the people to go into the wilderness of Shur. They were in Shur for 3 days without water. Now think about that. If they were in Shur for 3 days without water, that meant they were also in Shur for 3 days without coffee. So after 3 days, they head to a place called Marah, M-A-R-A-H. Now there was a reason why the place was called Marah. Marah means bitter spring. So now they have water in Marah, but it's bitter. It's undrinkable. As we say in the water business, it's not potable. So once again, the people complained to Moses. Moses said, "Yo, God, do you hear this going on?" God says, "Calm down, Moses. Take that piece of wood over there and throw it in the water." So Moses picks up the piece of wood, throws it in the spring, and the bitter water became sweet. Now, do you know how many dollars we could have saved in Origsburg on treatment plants and chemicals if we could just pick up a piece of wood and throw it in the water? Right, Donna? Yeah, Donna's back there shaking her head. Chapter 15 then ends with the people in Elim with plenty of water. And by the way, I'm from Philadelphia, so I can say W-O-O-D-E-R. And an abundance of palm trees. We open chapter 16, and now the Israelites pack up again and are heading to the wilderness. Now, there's only one problem out there in the wilderness. There's no food. Now, there's a hint in the first verse of this chapter about how long the Israelites have been out of Egypt. The 15th day of the second month tells us that they've been out of Egypt for a month, because remember, they left on the 15th day of the first month. So they've been out of Egypt a month. What we don't know for sure from the text is how long they've been out in the wilderness. But there is one thing we know for sure. They're hungry. They need food. So once again, they're complaining to Moses and Aaron. And this time it is really interesting. If we had died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, at least we would not have been hungry. Instead, you, meaning Moses and Aaron, drag us out here to starve to death. So here's poor Moses and poor Aaron doing what they're told. God says to do it, and they're getting blamed for everything by these people. So the text isn't clear this time whether Moses reached out to God again or God stepped in as soon as the people complained. Because the next verse is, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them, whether they will follow my instruction or not." And then it goes on to say on the sixth day, they're to take 2 days' worth, because there's not going to be any on the seventh day. Now, what's interesting is when I typed this in to the computer, it got one of those green squigglies under it because the sentence structure wasn't right. So Bill Gates is telling God that God doesn't know how to structure his sentences. Think about that for a minute. Now, here's where this text gets interesting. Moses and Aaron gather the people and tell them, in the evening, you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning, you shall see the glory of God. Now, God didn't say anything about morning and evening. And notice that Moses didn't say anything about those gathering instructions or a test either. So in the next verse, Moses said, "When the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning." And then a few verses later, we hear from God. "At twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." So I have a question. Where did the meat come from? In verse 4, all God talked about was bread. God didn't mention meat back in the 4th verse. So reading through the commentaries, I picked up a couple of theories. One idea is that when the Torah was being prepared and compiled in Babylon, the compilers took a strand from one source and a strand from another source and combined them. And when they combined them, they did not catch the inconsistency about the meat and resolve it. Clearly, Debbie did not proofread that text before it was printed. Now that may explain the meat, but it certainly doesn't explain why Moses did not repeat what God had told him. So here's the other theory. Moses heard what God told him and then went to speak to the people. But Moses wasn't only speaking to the people because Moses knew God was listening. Moses, the same Moses who needed company to go to confront Pharaoh, was now ready to send a message to God on behalf of the people God had called him to lead. God, Moses is saying, these people are out here in the wilderness. No food. They're hungry. They don't need a stinking test right now, and what they need is some encouragement. And they need food. And by the way, they don't just need bread. They need meat. They need some protein. God got the message. God responded to Moses' request and provided the Israelites meat as well as bread. The people got their meat, and the next morning they woke to find the bread on the ground. The bread Moses told them was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. What am I going to do? There was a fear of the future in that woman's voice, a fear of the uncertainty that was before her. The Israelites were afraid also. They were afraid they were going to starve to death. Their fear was that great that they longed to go back to Egypt. It's funny how we only remember the good things about the past when we're in trouble in the present, and then we long for the good old days. I wonder if at a certain point in time that woman's fear was expressed as anger. I wonder if that anger was directed at God. And I wonder how many of us have been angry at God, or maybe are angry at God right now. Are we angry about the death of a loved one? Are we angry about a diagnosis we did not want? Are we angry because of a job loss or a bad grade or losses we or those close to us have sustained due to the natural disasters or man-made disasters around the world? Are we angry because of a life situation going on? What do we do? What do we do if we're angry at God? This morning's text tells us what to do. We let God know. I'm angry with you, God. Why did this have to happen? I'm angry with you, God. My family didn't deserve this. I'm angry with you, God. And I imagine we all have endings to that sentence. In chapter 14, the people complained to Moses because they were trapped between the Egyptians and the Red Sea. In chapter 15, they complained to Moses about not having potable water. And in chapter 16, in our text this morning, God hears complaints once again. This time the people are angry because they don't have anything to eat. Now, I don't know how it was for any of you, but if I did this much complaining in my house, my mom and dad would have said, keep it up and I'll give you something to complain about. And I suspect, and she'll back me on this, I think, I used that expression once or twice as a parent. But it wasn't God's answer. When the people complained about the Egyptians, God took care of the Egyptians. When the people complained about the bitter water, God gave them sweet water. When the people complained about being hungry, God gave them food. God didn't get angry. God didn't lash out in frustration. God heard the complaint and met the need. And in that text this morning, God did more than meet the need. God said, go out each day before the sun gets hot and gather the bread you need for that day. On the sixth day, gather enough for 2 days. There won't be any, God said, on the seventh day. Now, it takes 3 or 4 more chapters before the people learn why that is. It's only in chapter 20 when God says the seventh day will be the Sabbath, the day of rest. So yeah, these instructions are a test, and maybe Moses thought better of telling the hungry people that God was testing them. But these instructions are something else. These instructions create a structure in the people's lives. They create a reliable constant in the turmoil of their wilderness lives. So can these instructions be a reliable constant in the turmoil of our lives? Is God telling us what we need to do to have some structure in our wilderness? I think so. But I'm not hungry. I don't have to go out every morning and gather bread off the ground. So for us, I wonder if this text is not referring to physical hunger, but spiritual hunger. And these instructions are not for gathering physical food, but spiritual food. So no, the constant is not that we have to go out and collect bread from the ground before the sun gets warm. but we collect spiritual nourishment by starting the day with prayer, meditation, and reflection. Maybe, if you're like me, before the sun gets warm. The constant in the turmoil of our wilderness may be the half hour or so that we devote each morning to a spiritual practice. And there's one other thing that God told the Israelites. On the sixth day, you pick a double portion. There will be nothing there on the seventh day, because I want you to rest on the seventh day. Now, this would be a new concept for the Israelites, because remember, they're just a month out from being in slavery where there was no rest. There was no time to rest. They were constantly meeting those quotas. So this is new to them. This is a whole new concept for them. So what does Sabbath mean for you and I? What does it mean to devote one day to rest? Is Sabbath one of our spiritual practices? And how can we devote one day to rest because of technology that makes sure no matter where we are, we can be reached? I was in a culvert one day and still managed to get a call. Let me offer one way. Last week, I sent an email to someone about a meeting that took place this week. Now, I knew the person would not be able to attend the meeting because they were going to be out of town, but I wanted to make sure she had the agenda. When I sent the email, I received an automatic reply. Friday is my Sabbath day, and I will not be responding to email messages on Friday. The message then went on to explain that she would be out of town and have limited access until she returned later in the week. So what would it be like for each of us to set up an automatic reply on our email accounts for our Sabbath day? What would it be like to create our own constant amid the turmoil? And if we did, wouldn't that be part of the answer to the question, what am I going to do? Amen. Now, in body or in spirit, please rise as we sing number 1, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore You.